Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. So today I'm going to be talking about basically what our team has experienced over the past year of kind of transitioning more to building products as opposed to traditional websites or CMS sites or e-commerce sites, all that kind of fun stuff. Within ResIM, we have a little blog on the website, and I have sort of a condensed version of this in blog form. If anybody's interested, that is the link. And I'm also on the internet at this handle pretty much everywhere except for GitHub, which is Christina Elise, because I made it when I was young and I promised my mom I wouldn't use my real name on the internet. So Twitter, Instagram, all that kind of thing. So a little bit about me very quickly. I started programming when I was 10, thanks to good old Neopets. Really wanted a customized page for my Neopets. And video games kind of led to web development. I did some in high school, but our school wasn't particularly up to speed on teaching kids how to code. So that kind of came in university where I focused on video game development. We did have some web development classes at McGill, but they had us build e-commerce sites using C because, that's the future of web development. And then I did a research project with Ubisoft, decided I didn't really want to do video game development, moved to London, Ontario, and now I'm with ResIM. So what do I do at ResIM? What does our team do? So as it says in the little pamphlet, I'm a custom web applications lead developer. We have a few different teams at ResIM. We have a team that deals with content management systems. We have a team that deals with just basically handling support. And we have the team that I'm a part of, which is essentially building products. Every now and then we work with the other teams, but we specifically build, as it says, custom web applications. We have back-end developers, one single front-end developer who works with our team, a designer, a QA person, and then a project manager, and that kind of rounds out the custom web app team. For my part, I meet with clients, and I'm kind of responsible for writing user story documents, basically designing the way we're going to implement certain features, explaining that to the client so that they're not terrified, and then working with the project manager or the product manager to basically set the client's expectations and timelines and all that kind of fun stuff. We build enterprise applications. We built a tracking system for a furniture installation company that was kind of interesting. And we do resource management for health units within London, Ontario. We have just recently built a massive social network, which is probably the biggest project we've ever built and was an interesting learning curve. And then we also do dynamic application systems for universities and colleges, most recently coming up with a way to automatically calculate the financial need for a particular student based on all the parameters the university uses. This is our company. We have a Lego table. Costs a lot of money, surprisingly, even though it's from Lego. So when I talk about a product, I feel like there are a lot of different definitions for what people might consider a product. When I use that word, I'm basically talking about applications or software that you interact with at a more complex level. So something like Twitter or Slack or Facebook or any kind of social network versus sort of a more informational or promotional website or something like an e-commerce site, although that sweater is pretty awesome. This is our typical project setup. As I'll talk about, we just started using Laravel, which is fun. We use agile development practices, and our stack used to be LAMP. Now we use, I don't even know exactly how you say this now that it's no longer LAMP, but LNMP for Nginx, which is really not as nice to say. We use Vagrant as our virtual machine, and now we're starting to use BugHerd, which I'll talk about a little bit as well, to kind of manage client feedback. So I'm going to talk about some challenges we faced, and we've faced quite a few over the past year. It's been an experience. I think the biggest challenge has been with clients, and as an agency, we've worked with clients for every single project. But it's been very interesting working with a particular subset of clients, and clients that come to us wanting to build a product that represents their company. And a lot of the times, they think their idea is brilliant, and for a lot of them, it is. A lot of the time, it's a great project. We're excited to work on it. But you also have to be very careful with dealing with a client who thinks that there is absolutely nothing wrong with their idea, and you can build it exactly as is, send it out to market, and it will succeed in all ways. We've had those clients that actually do have that idea, and then we've had clients come to us with what they think is a brilliant idea, and is actually quite clever, but they didn't do any research, and Apple bought it 2 years ago, and it was built by another company, and that's danger. Another big challenge for us has to do with using Laravel, which I love as a framework. It's been really enjoyable to work with, but none of us had actually used it before it was selected for our biggest project we've ever built. And part of this was we had a lot of resource turnover. So originally there was a different lead developer on our team, and he loved Laravel, and it was awesome, and I don't blame him. It's a great framework. But then he left the company, and I came and took over the project, and none of the developers had actually worked with it before. So I think one of the biggest challenges we faced was essentially using a massive project as a learning sandbox for this new framework. And I think my biggest piece of advice would be scheduling time into a production schedule so that you actually have time to work and test a framework and kind of learn all of your mistakes early on, rather than learning them while you're building a project, because it's never fun to go back and look at work you did 6 months ago when you didn't really understand the framework and realize, oh my gosh, I did everything wrong. Oh, and yeah, Laravel docs are awesome, and I owe all of those guys beers. And a huge thanks for saving me from crying myself to sleep at night. Another big challenge is the client doesn't necessarily know what they want. We discovered this very frequently. Client has a very general idea of what they want, but they don't have anything necessarily concrete, and it's kind of been our challenge and our responsibility to direct them and say, okay, well, you ask for these features, but did you think about how X, Y, Z might affect A, B, and C? And when someone comes to you with no foundation and no real clue about what exactly they want to see their product become, that can be quite an interesting challenge. Another big challenge we faced when building products, especially on very large-scale projects, is as a company that typically built content management systems, we had been using our own framework. It worked great. Content management system sites were fun to work with. But a lot of us really started experiencing just how much one thing can affect every other thing on a project, especially as that project grows in scale. So I've found, at least when we're building a product, the flow kind of has multiple paths. You're not essentially going through a checkout process and one step leads to the next step leads to the next step. There can be a lot of different external influences that necessarily work or break all the things. So for example, one of our projects had a booking manager, an instant messaging application feature, profile management, content management, and a social media interaction component. Versus some of the other projects we've built just had a checkout process and basically a simple user profile. So we had a lot of other variables to consider. Just different challenges, really. That kind of is what it boiled down to. We reached a point where we were experiencing different challenges with building these products in comparison to what we had been used to building. Another big challenge for us was that even adding a single feature or making a major change to a feature could be disastrous. When a client came to us and said, that feature we decided upon about 4 months ago, in order for this product to work, our entire company depends on us changing this one feature. Please change it. And it was agreed to. But if you don't necessarily foresee needing to go back and make extreme changes to certain features, it can be very difficult in the future to have to kind of deal with that. So one of the things we learned is that it's really advantageous to build your code in such a way that you can add or augment features relatively easily without necessarily tacking on days and days of work. And I feel like this kind of applies to every piece of software or every application or any project. But we found foreseeing the need to change, especially core features that had been agreed upon, it was very difficult to kind of foresee that challenge. So where we succeeded. Despite the challenges, we actually had a few places where we did pretty well. In terms of code quality and technical debt, we did pretty well here. We had a relatively small team, about 5 people. Thankfully, all of us cared a lot about code quality and code consistency, and it might have been because I rammed last year's talk down their throats and said this is really important that we pay attention to it. But everyone really cared about that. So we made sure that our code was consistent. We actually emphasized commenting. It's one of those things that we all kind of say, oh, I'll go back and write comments later. But in this project, especially with how quickly it grew, it was pretty invaluable that we understood what all of the other developers were attempting when they were actually writing their code. We made sure we used helpful Git commit messages, especially when one person would be working on someone else's feature or something would break and one person might not be available. yeah, basically slamming your hands on the keyboard and using that as a commit frustrates everyone. So we tried to make our commit messages as useful as possible. And then communication. As a team, we tried to communicate very effectively, basically explaining what we had built. We had a lot of stand-ups. We just tried to maintain open lines of communication, and that seemed to work very well. So in terms of code quality, these are the things we did on a pretty regular basis. You know, every now and then, you kind of fail hard when you're having a really bad day, but for the most part, we tried to keep these 6 things consistent. Updating obsolete comments. Whenever a function was changed, we tried to update those so the next person wouldn't hate their lives. We tried to not be lazy with writing code and to make sure that everybody remembered we'll likely be looking at this for the next 10, 11, 12, 14 months. Let's try to keep the code consistent and you know, use best practices. Be nice to your future self, approaching the code as though you'll need to add some kind of functionality within the next 2 months, which tended to be the case with a lot of different clients. They would come back and want to change something, at least over the course of the project. So we tried to really be considerate of that. And then we agreed on structure and formatting for the team. So within each of our files, we structured everything the same way. We had functions declared the same way, and it really made looking at someone else's code feel less alien. And that just seemed to work quite well for us. Communicating with other team members so that you don't mess up their work. That was a big one. We kind of learned that the hard way a couple of times with front-end and back-end devs not necessarily communicating the best until one thing broke the other thing and vice versa, and then we realized, okay, we all need to sit down and talk. And then mentoring newer developers, especially on large projects. We've had a fair bit of turnover at the company, new people coming in, and it was really important that the new people coming in understood how the company worked, understood what we valued in terms of the projects we were putting out into the world, understood the kind of code we wanted to write, and mentorship within the company has become very important for that. So, I mean, I feel like mostly everybody understands why code quality matters, but for us, especially with some of the largest projects we've built at the company, and multiple team members, we're jumping around a lot. You might be on a bug fix to a feature and somebody else is doing your work and all this kind of thing. So maintaining code quality really cut down on all the moments where we had no idea what was going on, the WTF moments, cut down on bugs, and it cut down on the time required to basically change any existing features when it was necessary. And this is a link to last year's talk on technical debt, in case anybody's interested. We try to use a lot of that information within the company to kind of cut down on it. The other thing we did pretty well is manage resources. So because we have separate teams for separate types of projects, it made it a little bit easier to deal with client feedback. So most of the time, I think teams try to prioritize bug fixes, especially for launched websites or applications. And feature requests, at least we've found as an agency, need to be fit in, but they tend to not be as critical as bug fixes because something is broken. So it can kind of be an interesting challenge. But because we have separate teams and we have our product and application development team, we can really work specifically on the projects that fall within that category, which means that our resources are really focused on that project and the client hears back from us pretty quickly. So depending on the issue, we usually had a same-day turnaround time for bug fixes, which kept everyone pretty happy. And it was often within a couple of hours, and this would have been more difficult back in the day when our company was kind of just different people on different projects and kind of switching everybody around. We also were able to implement features much quicker, which I think the client appreciated. And the team was more familiar with the project because they had been consistently with the project from essentially day one, with the exception of some of the turnover we had in terms of resources. The other thing that we did pretty well was organizing our tasks and communicating within the team. In terms of actual organization of what needed to be done, we used Trello a little bit and Kanban boards, which are, I guess, kind of the same thing, but we mostly used GitHub issues and labels that for all of us just felt the most familiar. It felt a little bit easier. People tended to forget about the Trello boards, so we kind of just threw that aside after the first couple of months. And then having the ability to reference past discussions with your team members was pretty critical, so we use Slack within the company for everybody. And then we also used GitHub issues and comments just to kind of maintain a history of what everybody's been talking about, as well as Google Docs. We use Google Docs for our sprint documents, for any sort of technical documents associated with a project, and as well for user stories. So what we learned a lot. We learned a lot from making mistakes. And I think the biggest thing we learned is that a foundation, especially for a large-scale project, is critical. Setting up project parameters with the client can make a world of difference. And especially because we work with a lot of startups, there are a lot of ideas, everyone's very excited, this is going to be the thing that brings us all millions of dollars, and it's really easy to lose focus on what we need to basically create as a foundation for the product and then build upon. And sort of related to this is charting a path for that initial structure for the project. And because, at least what we've found with the projects that we're working on, there isn't necessarily that single flow of functionality that can be kind of like a branching path of functionality. Having a path that sort of charts all the different ways that can affect your product has been very important. You might have a task pretty well defined, but if you don't necessarily know how that task is going to affect other tasks or how other tasks will affect that one particular feature, it can be very difficult to work with. So for example, we have a booking system with one of our projects. And the basic task is allow user A to book user B. But what some people may not think about, and especially the client, because they kind of come to us and say, build it, is that there are a lot of different ways and that can either go wrong, go right, or just affect other parts of your product. So how does user A find user B? Is it like Facebook where you just start typing someone's name and it does a search? Do you have to already be connected to that person? How do those permissions work? Are both parties required to accept the booking request? Can user B renegotiate the requested date and time? And what happens if it isn't accepted within a particular time frame? There are a lot of different variables to consider. So our task really grew from building the single item of functionality that we were very used to several different associated items that could all kind of affect each other. And we had to plan for all of them, along with any other associated features outside of that single task that might affect that other task. So our feature list really grew very quickly. And something that we might have looked at initially to be like, okay, well, we just want to book a user. That's not that complicated. Ended up kind of becoming a bit of a tree of all this branching functionality that we really needed to consider how all of that worked. So when dealing with features that are heavily dependent on other aspects of the application, scope creep and functionality changes become way, way bigger. And that's something that we learned very early on is if you have one item that's being affected by all these other different things, you change that one thing, you really have to look at how it affects everything else. And that can be challenging to foresee. And it's something that really needs to be considered when you're planning out the product as a whole. So like I say, the best way to avoid this is being preemptive with planning, the planning process. And that's something that we eventually got much better at. But initially, it was something we learned the hard way. So in terms of how we actually planned, we did a lot of mini startups with specific sub-teams. So the back-end devs would get together, the front-end devs would get together, front-end dev and lead developer, designer and front-end developers, everyone kind of talked amongst themselves, and we kept note of what we were discussing. We had detailed client developer meetings, very detailed, like 3 to 4 hours. Sometimes brutal, but absolutely necessary, especially when the client couldn't necessarily explain exactly what they wanted, and we had to make sure we were all on the same page. And we needed to map out exactly how certain features were working. And then we also had detailed sprint documents. So the client knew exactly what was being built, when it was being built, when they would expect it, and what we had all agreed upon. But yeah, at the early stages, we needed to plan more. The other big thing we learned was documenting everything. Because especially when you have turnover within a project, you never really want to rely on the client to tell you what you promised them, because that never ends well. Especially scope creep. And I feel like within an agency, whenever you're dealing with any client, this is something that, if you don't have a client that at least tries to creep some kind of new feature in, you've hit the jackpot. But it's understandable. It's something that I feel like a lot of us probably experience who work with clients. And if you have documentation, you have a legitimate reason to say, no, sorry, we can't do this if you can't do it. And then you're not going to be accused of basically not giving them something that you promised them, and everyone is just much happier. So we had this one huge project that has been completed over the course of 10 months, a little bit longer than 10 months now. And because there was resource turnover and not everything was documented, we lost a lot of meeting minutes, so to speak. There were certain aspects of the project that some people had knowledge of and others didn't. And if that person left the company, then suddenly nobody had knowledge of it. So documentation for us really became security. And especially when passing on new information to new members of the team, that became vitally important. We wanted to start taking meeting minutes. And that just meant, as tedious as it was, recording everything that had been discussed, sharing it with the client, and then making sure that they signed off on the agreed upon changes, because that way everybody was happy and everybody knew exactly what had been agreed to. And these Dilbert comics exemplify that. Testing also became something that we realized was vitally important. In some of our smaller projects, we've used unit testing, we've used automated testing, but within large-scale products, it became so much more important. This is a really interesting graph. There's a great productivity report. It's from 2013, so it's a little old, but it's still applicable, from Rebel Labs. And that's the link to the actual report down there. But it basically shows the effects of automated functional testing on predictability and quality. And predictability in this case technically means just meeting your timeline. And quality is, of course, the quality of the project. So when you have a branching path of all this functionality, you're necessarily going to have a branching path for testing. And testing each individual feature requires testing all of the other associated features, and that can be very difficult. So if you have unit tests set up, if you have automated testing, that really cuts down on your QA time. And as we see from that graph, it actually really affects the quality of your project. So basically what we discovered is that we moved from having this single path of functionality that we had to just test this one line of things to testing all of these different interrelated features. So what we really started doing was you finish a feature, you test it, and then you test it again, and then you give it to someone else to test. And then you also implement automated and unit testing. And that way you've tested all the things as thoroughly as you can even possibly imagine. And even then you're still going to find bugs, because that's our life. But it really cuts down on all of the QA time and the potential for disaster. So basically related to this, at the beginning of our project, we didn't have quality assurance working with us. We have a QA team within the company, but for the first little while, we didn't really have a designated person helping us QA. And what we really learned is, as a developer, you can be like, I tested it, it's good. I know exactly what I'm building, and I know exactly that it works. But it's very easy to forget that we're not robots. Especially as developers, we start building something, and we know the process, and we're so used to actually testing it as we build that we know exactly how to go through all the steps without necessarily causing an issue that someone who might not be as familiar with this particular feature might cause. So one thing we really learned is that QA became our best friend, because our QA team wasn't familiar with the project. They would click around on different things that a traditional user would click around and kind of break. And that really helped us in terms of cutting down on bugs that the client would hopefully not see. Another big challenge we faced, and what we really learned, is that your client, and I feel like this is kind of applicable for most clients that work with an agency, but especially with startups, especially with people who are building a product, your client thinks they're your only client. And I don't think this is something to necessarily be frustrated about. I think it's very understandable, especially when a business comes to you and they're building a product. This product is representative of their business. If this product fails, their business can fail, and that's a lot of pressure. So you can really expect a lot of communication. 1 a.m. phone calls, they can find you on social media and find your personal cell phone number. That has happened. PowerPoint presentations where they've comped out every single view that they want for the site and send it to you at 12 a.m. and want it implemented Monday morning. That stuff can happen. And I think it takes a lot of patience and a lot of reassurance with the client, a lot of communication, and reassuring them that you are enthusiastic about their product and you want it to succeed as much as they want it to succeed, because it's also a reflection of your work and your company. So along these lines, communicating with your client becomes vitally important. We received a lot of feedback, especially over the course of 10, 11, 12 months. You have a lot of feedback from the client over the course of that time period, and it's important to consolidate it. We need to let the client know that they're being heard. And that was one thing that we learned very early on, because, like I said, they are very invested in this product. It's something that is representative of their company. So we tried a few different things. Initially, we were getting feedback from the clients in email form, and that was awful. Like 6 emails, all with different feature requests and content changes, was just terrible. So then at one point, we tried Google Docs, and that was better. But really, Google Docs only seemed to work when you could kind of cut down on the amount of feedback that was coming to you. So as soon as the client was able to edit that document, and it grew to 115 pages, then it didn't really work so well. The other thing that we considered were GitHub issues. And we've used GitHub issues with other projects, but the problem is GitHub doesn't provide an issues-only view for clients or for guests. You essentially have to create a separate repo and not actually have any code in it and just have issues that you want the client to be able to see, because you don't necessarily want the client, at least for us, we didn't want them to see all of our communication and all of the issues that we had within our main repository. So you're kind of wasting an extra repo just for the sake of allowing the client to see a bunch of issues. So now we use something called BugHerd. It was suggested by our QA team, and it's pretty great. And we don't have any affiliation with BugHerd. It's just been kind of life-saving for us, especially in the warranty period of our projects. It allows in-page feedback and visual bug pins. So if something goes wrong in a certain place, it'll tell you exactly where it went wrong when they submit the bug report. It has automatic screenshots, which our QA team is so grateful for, because going through and taking screenshots of every possible thing that could go wrong is so tedious. A visual task board, kind of like a Trello board. And then it also syncs with your version control system. So for us, it's GitHub. And you can have guest access and CSV exports. So for us, that has been a really great tool for consolidating all of that client feedback and making sure that nothing actually gets lost, because that can be bad. The other thing we learned is that just because somebody comes to you and they want to own a web product and they want to build a web product doesn't necessarily mean they know anything about the internet or how it will necessarily function. And this sort of falls into the same realm as client thinking that they're your only client. It's really easy to forget that not everybody is as internet savvy as all of us might be. And so sometimes it really requires being patient and explaining in kind of layman's terms how something might function, because otherwise people can get frustrated, and that's never good. So the last thing that we really learned, and that has helped us a lot over the course of these larger products, is refactoring where we can, wherever we can. This is something that I've talked about before, that you don't have to go back and refactor your whole project. That can be very time-consuming, and it's not necessarily your best use of time. But you know, we're human. We make mistakes. We have days where you're having a really crappy day, and your code reflects that. So if you're in a function, or you're working on a feature, or you're in a certain part of your application, and you can go back and you can refactor certain parts of it while you're already in there, you're saving yourself time in the future. And that really affects the code quality of your project. It affects what you have to deal with in the future, so you're being nicer to your future self. And it means you don't really have to go back 2 months in the future and kind of go through all these different functions that you don't really have a reason to be in. You're already there. You might as well just kind of update it while you are. So that's basically what we've experienced over the past year. Things that worked, things that didn't, things that we will never ever do again. And thank you all for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free.